So we're going to talk about sales velocity this week, which is the metric you've probably never heard about, and almost certainly the metric that you're not using, but is potentially one of the most powerful metrics that you can look at for trying to get an understanding of the overall performance of both your sales and your marketing operation. So a lot of the pieces that make up this metric come from the stuff that marketing is doing. A lot of it comes from the stuff that sales is doing, but it also really goes to the heart of how sales and marketing are very interconnected. If sales isn't preparing the customer well if marketing isn't preparing the customer before it reaches sales, is going to have a struggle. They're going to have to do more work to close that deal. If marketing is providing sales with poor quality leads, you're likely going to have to work harder to close them. You're probably going to close less. So a lot of what happens in sales around how long does it take to close a deal, your likelihood of closing a deal, even things like your ability to establish pricing power. Can sales reliably close this account without having to offer big discounts? A lot of that's driven by what marketing does. So this is a really nice high-level blending of the activities of both sales and marketing and how they're deeply interconnected in ways that are not always obvious to the company. And the other thing is that it also gives a view of the world that very closely aligns with how a CFO and a CEO think about sales and marketing, because they don't think about it as two things generally. They think about it as this combined black box. And so the CFO comes and periodically pours money into the top of the black box, and your VP of sales and marketing or your chief commercial officer picks up the black box, shakes it vigorously, and everyone hopes that money drops out the bottom. And hopefully more money drops out the bottom than went in the top. But it's very much a black box for people higher up in the company. And so it's useful to provide them with a view of that black box that really corresponds with how they think about the world. And sales velocity is that metric.
Yeah, so I've been hearing about sales velocity for a couple of years. I've never worked for a company that has used it as a metric that I've ever seen or heard discussed. And so I think when I think about it, I'm like, okay, the underlying information we already have in the CRM. So as a salesperson, I'm like, okay, what is this going to do for me as a salesperson to change my worldview? And the answer is absolutely nothing. It's a management figure, right? So this is a tool that management is going to use to look at the program as a whole. And so it's not something that as an individual salesperson is really going to change what I do on a day-to-day basis.
Right. I would say it's a strategic metric, not a tactical metric.
Yeah, absolutely. But on the flip side, as salespeople, we all know that there's a lot of things that go into making a number, right? And, how fast can you close deals versus how big those deals are? And there's a lot of levers you can move. Product mix, that's another one. And so trying as an executive, like Dale was saying, to absorb those various factors into one number that you could maybe throw on a dashboard somewhere, I think sales velocity could be a great tool for that.
Yeah, and to talk real quick about how do you actually calculate this number? So there's actually two separate sales velocity numbers. So the one that's most often talked about is basically a forecasting tool. So you're trying to predict the future flow of recognized revenue into the company. But the way you calculate it is just the number of active opportunities. So it's the number of open deals, what your historical average deal value was. So on average, what does a sale look like in terms of dollars? And then your average win rate divided by the average length of the sales cycle. So if you've got a higher win rate, this number is going to go up. If you can shorten your sales cycle, since that's in the denominator, the velocity number is going to go up. But what you're actually measuring here is the rate at which the overall sales and marketing effort is bringing new revenue into the business. The other thing that's important to understand is that this is not the same thing as cash flow, and it gives you a very different tool to use than a cash flow statement. So this is recognized revenue, which again is not the same thing as cash flow, which is collected revenue. So you're looking at a number that more closely aligns with what sales is doing week to week, which is this week we're bringing in this much revenue. Now it might take us 90 days to collect that, depending on who we're selling to, but the revenue is on the books. And so it gives you a very quick look at the rate at which sales is per unit of time, per week, per month, per quarter, is bringing revenue in the door.
Right. So if you go back to the components, there's a number of familiar components here that I think the presentation of which the nuances are important, right? So a lot of times when we're doing a sales forecasting exercise or when sales management is reporting to strategic managers, we're looking at things like what's the total size of the pipeline. And of course, as a salesperson, the way you game that is you add more deals to the pipeline, you're super optimistic about the value of those deals, and it looks like you're generating a lot of pipeline. You also have a weighted pipeline, right? And so that's where you weight the likelihood that any given deal is going to close by its value, and then you add those all up. And that's right there is very similar to two of the elements in the numerator of sales velocity. Win rate, again, is hybrid, right? So in sales velocity, we're taking the historic win rate. And if you look in your CRM, that's the projected win rate. And it could be optimistic for one salesperson, could be pessimistic for another salesperson. There's a lot of play in how those things are measured in the CRM. But one of the nice things about sales velocity is we're doing a look back for a certain period, and we're looking at the actual sales cycle that was achieved and the actual deal value. And then looking at, okay, how many deals do we have in the active funnel? And we're using the values from the historic period to calculate that. But from, I think, the marketing perspective and from the, I don't even know what else to call it, the velocity perspective, like when you start to break this down by number of days, I think that really emphasizes the importance of shortening the sales cycle. A lot of times we think about, okay, how can we bundle more products together or increase the price or increase the number of customers? And just as important to the health of a business is how can we shorten the sales cycle?
And the other thing in there too is that you can have salespeople with very different sales styles that on the surface, it's not clear which one is performing better. But if you look at the sales velocity associated with each individual salesperson's deals, it's a way to balance them out. And a specific example is you could have someone that closes at a relatively low rate, but they cycle through their sales opportunities at a very fast rate versus someone who's much more deliberative that has a much higher close rate, but it takes them a long time to close. And these are very different, but not uncommon sales styles. And so the question is, which is better, fast or slow? And in the end of the day, from the business's standpoint, they don't really care. What they care about is the rate at which you're bringing revenue in per unit of time. And so it gives you an interesting tool to be able to measure across both different salespeople, but likewise, you can look at different marketing channels. So, we got a bunch of leads from Google search, but then we also got a bunch of badge scans from the last conference we went to. Which is generating more revenue for us, the badge scans or the Google search leads? And so again, this cuts through all of the issues of the technical distinctions between the different marketing channels. And it gets to the heart of what matters to the business, which is those leads brought in this much revenue per unit of time. And that's really, at the end of the day, the thing that matters the most to the business. One of the other things that I want to point out is the importance of this, of the name of this, is sales velocity. It's sometimes called pipeline velocity, sometimes called sales pipeline velocity. Right now, we're just shortening it to sales velocity. But it is a velocity. If you go back to your physics class, a velocity is a scalar, the rate of change over time of a scalar metric. It is miles per hour, not miles. And so what you're measuring here is dollars per week or dollars per month or dollars per quarter. You have to make sure that you normalize all of the time units in the calculation to get that right. But one of the things that I've seen is that there are a couple of people, specifically on LinkedIn, that talk a lot about sales velocity, neither of which have a clue as to what they're talking about. And the way you can tell they don't have a clue is that they do not understand that this is a velocity. And so they talk about it in terms of dollars. And then they'll try to draw conclusions from this dollars value that are just completely bonkers. So you have to be very careful who you listen to. And I would say maybe 10% of the people I see talking about this have any real understanding of what it really is. And the tell is always the fact that they don't understand that it's dollars per unit of time. They only talk about it as dollars. And the equivalent would be, if you're in the car with me and we're driving somewhere and you ask, how fast are we going? And I say, we're going 60 miles. And they say, we're just going around the block. It can't be 60 miles. No, I'm looking at this dial on the dashboard. The pointer is pointing right at the 60. We're clearly going 60 miles. That's someone who does not understand the question and does not understand how to read their data. And so you want to be careful about this and to be very certain that you understand that you're looking at the rate of revenue recognition per unit of time. It is a rate of flow of money out the pipeline into the bank. So that's always an important thing to be considering.
Yeah, I think that's why pipeline value is so popular, because it's easy to conceive of, hey, my pipeline's worth $10 million. Or you weight it and it's worth $5 million. That's, I think, much more, it's a lot easier to grasp conceptually. Yeah. But I want to point out that this kind of metric is only as good as the underlying data. And so if you lack discipline in collecting data in the CRM in terms of lost deals, for example, there's a lot of deals that are lost that are live perpetually as open in the CRM. There's a lot of deals that are lost that get deleted out of the CRM to artificially inflate the win rate. There's things that are misstaged or qualified improperly. And so the better your data is in the CRM, which is where all this is going to come from, the better metric you're going to have. The other thing that I think, especially small companies, are going to struggle with is do we have enough volume of data in the history and in the current pipeline to make this a robust measure? So when it changes month to month, let's say sales velocity goes from $3,000 per day to $4,000 per day, is that just a function of the noise that's inherent in the data we have, or is that actually a real change? And I think if you don't have a certain population of deals to look at, it's going to make the metric less useful.
So if you've got an expensive instrument and you sell one of them a month and that's it, you probably don't have enough data to make this work. If you're selling consumables, disposables, and you've got thousands of orders a day going out the door, you probably have plenty of data to be able to look at this. So a lot of this is dependent on the data. The other thing is the quality of the data. And one of the things that I've seen when I've gone in and tried to set this up is that the CRM tends to be completely polluted with obviously dead deals that the sales rep is swearing that it looks dead, but I'm pretty sure they're going to buy. and the thing about it is that part of what makes a good salesperson is being the eternal optimist, of always being convinced that eventually this thing's going to close. I'm convinced they're going to buy. And that's a really good personality trait, but you don't want it to be overly reflected in the data. And so there has to be some rules around it. At some point, once this thing has reached a certain stage and they're not coughing up a check, it's probably a dead deal. And we need to mark it as such. And so that kind of data hygiene becomes very important. And so a lot of what I've done when I've gone in and worked with companies around this, very first step is the data hygiene step, where you go through and you clean up the data and you get it all to a sensible, uniform state so that the data represents the reality of the underlying world. Then you've got a good starting point. Going back to this definition, what you're really doing is you're looking backwards in time at how the organization actually performed. What was your average deal value for things that closed? What was your win rate on projects that closed? And then how long did it take you to close those? And you're using that historical performance to try to apply that predictor metric against your active opportunities to do a prediction of forward week by week or month by month revenue recognition from what's in the pipeline right now. And this can actually be a very good statistic, but part of it depends on how well you define the active opportunities. And a lot of it depends on how well you define and select that predictor metric from your historical data. So if you've got to have enough data, you also have to have an appropriate amount of going back in time. If your organization looked radically different a year ago than it does now, if you're looking at your average deal value and your average win rate over a year, that's probably not a good metric. If you're looking at it over a month, that probably is a good metric of what's happening right now today. But if you only closed 2 deals last month, it's probably not a good metric. You probably need to go back 3 months or 6 months to do it. So again, there's no hard and fast rules, but you got to think about what's going on in the business, how the data looks, to understand how best to select the look back period for generating the predictor metric from your historicals. And so a lot of this is sensitive to, but it's also very common sense. When you sit down and you look at the data, it's very obvious what you should be doing. And one thing I would also say is that I have not come into companies where they're already using this, but I have used this. I first started using this back about 15 years ago when I was VP of Sales and Marketing for about a $55 million company. At the time, I didn't have a name for it. So this was before people referred to this as sales velocity, but it was a very obvious metric to try to come up with a way of a high level look at a blended metric that would give me a sense of the overall performance and give me a sense of where things are going to be going over the next few weeks in terms of what I should expect to see coming out of sales in terms of closed deals and the value of those deals. And I can say from my personal experience of being the VP of Sales and Marketing and using this, I found it very valuable. And but
I can only imagine what CRM was like 15 years ago. I recall from the distant past what it looked like, and it was not it was still very aspirational at that point.
But there was a lot of data hygiene work that had to be done. But at the same time, there was a lot of work around just in general getting some sensibility to the data we were storing so that you didn't have to clean it up. And that's the ideal place is to do that.
Yeah. If you have good data, it empowers so many things. And I think there's just a lack of effort that's made to make the data useful, right? We're your salespeople and marketing people spend a lot of time getting stuff into the CRM. And I think if you did a hand-raised survey, have you been disappointed by what the CRM has delivered to you in terms of actionable information? I think a lot of people would say, yeah, it's not quite delivered. So this is one of those hacks where if you don't have to implement it in the CRM, you can bring it out to Excel, you can look at it once a quarter, and you can hopefully draw something useful out of this in terms of understanding the levers that are moving your sales velocity.
Right. And the other thing that's useful, there's two versions of sales velocity. This is generally not recognized by people that talk about sales velocity, but usually what they're talking about is a prospective forecast based on a historical predictor metric. But at the same time, you can do this calculation with your historical actuals. And it's useful to do this and to follow this over time because you can get an overall trend that answers the question, is the overall sales and marketing effort getting better at their job or getting worse at their job? And if they're getting better, how are they getting better? And if they're getting worse, how are they getting worse and how can we fix it? And that is not always obvious from the forecast because as with all forecasts, they're not certain. This is the whole problem with the future. It's hard to predict. And so it's useful to also come back and do the historicals. It's also useful to do the historicals because it gives you a much rawer understanding of what you're actually measuring. And if you look at the way you calculate your historicals is you don't care about win rate because you know what the win rate was. It's already occurred. You don't have to make a guess as to what the deal size is going to be. The money's in the bank. So you're just looking at basically the total closed won deals over that time period times the average deal value divided by the length of the sales cycle. But it turns out you can go one step simpler. It is literally just the total recognized revenue by period divided by the average length of the sales cycle. So, this week we got X number of dollars, but it took us an average of 14 weeks to get that. So that gives you a sense of how your effort over time is basically spread across. You're averaging over the period of time that you're putting out this effort, the amount of money that you're generating at the end of that effort. So that gives you a really raw look at what it is you're actually measuring. And it also makes it very clear that this is a velocity and it's not just a number. It's not just a dollar number.
Yeah. So I guess one last thing I'd like to point out is for everybody out there that's not selling equipment that comes in nice, discrete units. If you're selling a consumable product to a customer who's buying over time, I think the best way to use a CRM and consequently sales velocity in that context is to look at, okay, we're looking at acquiring new customers. And we know from history that the average value of a customer for a year or for a quarter is X thousand dollars. That annual value or that periodic value then becomes the unit of analysis, where we're trying to take that as a deal size and multiply that by the number of new customers that are in the CRM with the potential to be acquired.
Yeah, and I think this is a very good point, because there are two very different types of sales operations that occur within biotech. One, you've got the giant box you're trying to sell. And once you got the box sold, you move on and you sell another one of those boxes. But then and again, a lot of my experience has been in things like the oligo business or sequencing services, where the goal of the sales rep is to basically bring a new account on, and that account will now generate an annuity over time, because they'll just keep ordering without the salesperson having to go back and reconvince them to buy their next oligo from you. So again, how you define the value of the deal is very dependent on what makes sense for your business and what makes sense for the nature of the product you're selling. If you're selling next-gen sequencers, it's pretty much the cost per box. But if you're selling molecular probes, it's how many you think they're going to buy over the next year, based on, again, you're going to base that on your historicals. But you're really looking at the average customer value for some forward period of time.
Yeah. Why don't we leave it there, Dale?
That sounds good.